Santos laughed at first, until she plugged in a silver USB and brought a dead man's name back to life. What happened next forced the entire country to face a truth Congress had buried for years. How many more names have been erased to protect men like him? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Room 241 felt like a pressure cooker seconds before detonation. Every red camera light was on, every seat filled. Reporters, aides, lawmakers, all holding their breath. Security stood rigid along the walls, eyes alert, hands close to their belts. This wasn't a hearing. It was an ambush wrapped in protocol. The tension in the air was thick, not from fear of violence, but from the certainty that someone's reputation, maybe someone's legacy, wouldn't survive the hour. George Santos sat in the witness chair like a man who thought charm could still save him. Perfectly groomed, navy suit crisp, smile sharp, but hollow. He scanned the room with a practiced arrogance, the kind worn by men who've lied so long they believe their own myths. But today, no lie would walk out unburned. Then Jasmine Crockett entered. She didn't need to speak. Her presence cracked through the silence like thunder. Eyes locked on Santos, her stride was slow, deliberate, each step saying, "You ran from the truth. I dragged it here." Once labeled too loud, too emotional, today she let silence speak for her. And Santos? He shifted, just slightly. But it was enough. The gavel came down like a gunshot. "This hearing is now in session," Chairwoman Hastings declared. "We will address the misuse of campaign funds by former Congressman George Santos." The room froze. Jasmine didn't blink. The fight wasn't starting. It had already begun. The room held its breath as the echoes of the gavel faded, like the final chime before a storm. Then with calculated slowness, George Santos leaned toward the mic. But it wasn't him who spoke first. His lawyer, a tall man in a charcoal suit with a voice as smooth as polished stone, stood up and adjusted his tie like a man about to perform surgery on the truth. "Let the record show," he began, "that my client appears today not as a criminal, but as a victim of political persecution." Gasps didn't erupt, but eyes widened. He walked a slow arc across the room, gesturing toward Jasmine with a smirk veiled in legalese. "This is not a hearing. It's a witch hunt orchestrated by those who fear the courage it takes to be different." The word different landed like a slap in a chamber built on decorum. "My client broke no laws. He simply broke the mold," the lawyer added, his voice rising with false conviction. The moment reeked of performance. Every syllable dripped with the oily charm of a man paid to twist facts into lifelines. But Jasmine, she didn't flinch. She didn't even blink, because she had heard it all before. They always called it a witch hunt, when the guilty feared fire. But Jasmine had no time for theatrics. She didn't come to argue with smoke. As the lawyer sat down, his satisfied grin still lingering in the air like cheap cologne, the room tilted ever so slightly toward silence. Every eye turned to Jasmine Crockett, not with expectation, but with tension, like the moment before a sniper exhales. She didn't move fast. She didn't make a show of anything. Her hand, steady as steel, reached across the desk and slid open a manila folder thicker than a Bible, labeled in sharp black ink. Santos, March 2022. Filings, no speech, no performance, just paper, truth, and precision. The metal clasp made a sharp snap, clean, deliberate, like the cocking of a rifle. She flipped a page, glanced once, and without looking up, spoke with a voice that didn't rise, didn't shake, only carried. "Mr. Santos," she said slowly, "do you recall who signed a donation of $8,400 to your campaign on March 17th, 2022? The question landed without force, but it hung, weighted, thick with meaning. It wasn't about the number. It wasn't even about the name. It was a scalpel wrapped in simplicity, offered without threat, yet undeniable in aim. Santos leaned back like a man amused by a schoolteacher's quiz. He smirked, eyes briefly darting to the cameras, before locking back onto Jasmine. "Of course," he said, chuckling under his breath. "A devoted supporter, generous soul, a proud American who believed in what I stood for." He shrugged as if the matter were beneath him. "What more is there to say?" The lie rolled off his tongue like it had 100 times before, practiced, polished, and utterly hollow. But for the first time, the room didn't laugh with him. No aide smiled, no reporter typed. They all watched Jasmine, who hadn't blinked once. But Jasmine wasn't looking for a confession. She came armed with something far more dangerous: evidence. Her movements were quiet, deliberate. She reached into her briefcase, not with urgency, but with the calm precision of someone who already knew what the next 5 minutes would destroy. The room, moments earlier filled with murmurs and skepticism, grew still. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. She pulled out a small silver USB drive. It gleamed under the recessed lighting like a surgical blade before an incision. It was unremarkable in size, slender, matte finished, no logo, no label. But in her hand, it felt heavier than any weapon. She held it for a moment, not for effect, but to let silence do what shouting never could. Then she stood, crossed to the main monitor setup at the front of the room, and without a word plugged the drive into the console. The screen blinked once, static and gray. Then it came to life. A digital spreadsheet appeared, projected in harsh fluorescent clarity. It was a list: donors, dates, amounts, transaction IDs, source banks. But this wasn't just campaign data. It was a graveyard in code. Jasmine walked back to her seat slowly, eyes never leaving the screen. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady, controlled, cold. "Let's scroll to line 17. The assistant controlling the monitor obeyed. The cursor hovered over a highlighted row, then expanded to show the full detail. But arrogance dies hard, and sometimes it tries to laugh its way through the flames. The air in room 241 had become thick enough to feel. No one spoke. No one coughed. Even the cameras, still rolling, seemed to hold their breath. The pile of documents Jasmine laid bare, receipts, dates, numbers that didn't lie, had turned the hearing into something colder, more dangerous than a legal inquiry. It felt like the moment before a dam breaks. And right in that silence, Santos did what men like him always do when the walls begin to creak. He reached for the only weapon he had left: mockery. He leaned toward the mic, elbow resting lazily on the table, and let out a low, theatrical chuckle. It didn't land. No one else laughed. But that didn't stop him. His voice, though steadier than it should have been, carried the same slick confidence he had worn like a tailored suit since the beginning. "You know," he began, smiling like a man who thought the cameras were still his allies, "if you're really as brilliant as people say, what is it they call you? White House lawyer? That's the rumor, isn't it?" His eyes flicked to the press gallery for effect, as if inviting them into the punchline. "Then tell me something, Jasmine. If you're so smart, why haven't you ever actually beaten me?" He shrugged, casually, as though he were talking over drinks and not under oath. "You talk a lot. You grandstand, you wave papers and ask questions. But I'm still here, still talking, still sitting in this chair while you're standing over there. Doing all this for what? Headlines?" It was a performance, nothing more. But it was meant to sting. He wanted the cameras to catch it, wanted the audience outside this room to hear him mock her credentials, her rise, her silence. To remind everyone watching that no matter what she said, no matter what she proved, he still got the last word. It wasn't just about the hearing, it was about power. And he was betting that a woman like Jasmine Crockett would react, would bite back, would crack. But she didn't. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't smirk, didn't break eye contact. She just stared at him, calm, grounded, like she was studying a man already halfway buried. There was no heat in her face, no sign that the insult had even made it past her skin. Her silence wasn't passive, it was loaded, heavy with the weight of every woman who's ever been talked over in a meeting, every black professional who's been told they're lucky to be in the room, every public servant who's had to work twice as hard just to be taken half as seriously. She didn't need to answer him, because the evidence was her answer, and the look in her eyes said it plainly. You're not still here because you're winning. You're still here because I'm not done yet. 40 Leonard H. McMillan. Donation, $8,400. Date, March 17th, 2022. Routing, Guan's confirmed address, 423 Eastfield Lane, Syracuse, New York. Status, deceased, May 2nd, 2019. Then on the right side of the screen, Jasmine had embedded something even more damning, a high-resolution image of Leonard McMillan's obituary from the Syracuse Herald, and beneath it, a photograph of his tombstone. The room didn't gasp. It froze. The kind of silence that fell wasn't out of awe. It was the quiet people give when reality arrives faster than they can prepare for it. A kind of collective stillness, as if everyone were afraid to even breathe in case it disrupted what they were witnessing. One journalist's pen slipped from her fingers. A junior staffer mouthed, "Jesus Christ." Even the chairwoman narrowed her eyes. Jasmine didn't react. She let the weight of the information settle before speaking again. Her eyes met Santos's. His smugness had not yet melted, but it cracked, just enough. "Mr. Santos," she said, each syllable weighed like iron, "can you explain why a man who died in 2019 donated the maximum allowable amount to your campaign in 2022? Her tone was surgical, precise, not loud, but impossible to ignore. There was no drama in her voice, no need for theatrics. The drama was in the data, the death certificate, and the rock-solid digital timestamp that said, "This money should never have moved." Santos opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at his lawyer, who leaned in and whispered something urgently. But Jasmine cut through it. "I'll remind you, Mr. Santos," she added, her voice rising only a hair. "You're under oath." Now the room breathed again, but it was a slow, collective exhale of anticipation, the kind people take before a building collapses. Santos chuckled, but it wasn't confident. It was the kind of laugh a man gives when he's trying to find footing on a floor that's already given way. He straightened his tie. "I have thousands of donors," he said finally, "some through third-party platforms. It's possible, maybe a clerical error, maybe someone else used his name." Jasmine leaned forward. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't blinking. She just stared at him, unblinking, until he faltered. "The donation came directly through your campaign portal," she said, tapping the paper in front of her. "Same email used in other verified transactions. Same billing address linked to your FEC filings. The only anomaly," she paused, "is that Leonard McMillan had already been buried for 3 years when this occurred." That landed like a hammer. This wasn't conjecture. This wasn't accusation. This was fact, verified, documented, cross-referenced, and exposed in full public view. For Jasmine, this wasn't just a takedown. It was a reckoning, not for the money alone, but for every sneer, every eye roll, every time someone like Santos laughed off accountability while women like her were asked to prove they belonged. This wasn't just about one donation. It was about a pattern, about rotation, and she had just peeled back the wallpaper to show everyone the mold. Still, she didn't gloat. She looked around the room once, at the press, the aides, the stone-faced committee members, and then back to Santos. "Do you have an answer?" she asked again, quieter now. "Or are we finished pretending this was just a paperwork error?" And for the first time, George Santos said nothing. The silence that followed wasn't mercy. It was the sound of the trap locking shut. Santos shifted in his seat, but it wasn't casual this time. His posture tightened, his knee bounced under the table, and the smirk he had worn like armor began to crack at the edges. His eyes darted, not to Jasmine now, but to the exit signs, to the committee panel, to the cameras overhead, as if searching for an escape hatch. He leaned toward the microphone too fast, the screech of it catching more nerves than attention. His voice came out sharp, forced and louder than it needed to be. "This is ridiculous," he said, the words tumbling over each other. "You're presenting fabricated documents. Anyone with access to a printer and a grudge could have made those." He laughed, a short, nervous burst that sounded nothing like confidence. "You don't have context. You don't have proof. None of this says anything about intent." But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she pulled another document from the folder. This time, it wasn't a spreadsheet or donor log. It was a hotel invoice printed in crisp black and white, bordered with gold. Waldorf Astoria, Washington, D.C. The date sat bold at the top, Mid-April, during a week when Santos had claimed to be on the road connecting with small donors. But the bill said otherwise. 5 nights in a luxury suite, champagne minibar, room service, laundry service, final total $3,876.54. Paid in full. Campaign card listed as method of payment. She didn't say a word as she laid it flat on the table. Then came the next, a credit card statement highlighting a charge from the Gucci flagship store in New York City. 2 pairs of men's leather loafers, one in black crocodile, one in oxblood, both size 10, matching cufflinks, gift wrapping. Total $1,243.77. Date of purchase? 2 days after a campaign fundraiser where Santos had claimed to barely break even. Still no words. A third sheet followed, this one even colder. A spa package from a luxury resort in Miami, labeled in the campaign ledger as staff development expense. The receipt included deep tissue massages, a poolside brunch, and a $400 mud wrap. Time-stamped during a congressional recess. Total, $1,092. Then Jasmine finally spoke. "Do you recognize these, Mr. Santos?" Her voice was flat, measured but heavy, as if each word carried the weight of every unpaid volunteer who had ever trusted his promises. "Because they're all tied to your campaign accounts. Every charge, every item, every lie." Santos opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat moved like he was swallowing a pill far too large. His lawyer reached out, whispered something, but even that didn't seem to land. What Jasmine was laying bare wasn't just financial fraud. It was arrogance. It was entitlement. It was the belief that rules were for other people, that if you spoke fast enough, dressed well enough, and smiled often enough, you could escape accountability forever. But now every receipt was a crack in that illusion. And Jasmine, calm, steady, unshaken, was peeling the mask off one thin sheet of paper at a time. But fragile pride always looks for a ledge to grab before the fall, and Santos wasn't ready to hit bottom. He could feel the narrative slipping from his fingers like sand, and desperation has a way of turning men into liars louder than usual. His tone shifted, not to humility, but to offense. If he couldn't outsmart her, he'd try to stain her. His voice rose just enough to break the heavy silence Jasmine had built. "Let's not pretend this is a crusade for truth," he snapped, the edge of mockery creeping back in. "You talk about integrity like it's something you invented. But didn't you take PAC money too, Congresswoman?" He let the words hang like a net, hoping they'd tangle her up. "Big checks from lobbyists, special interest groups, corporations with agendas. You want to lecture me while you cash their donations?" It was a familiar tactic, the false equivalency, the bait. If everyone's dirty, no one's guilty. And in that moment, he wore the smirk of a man who believed he just landed a hit. He even glanced sideways, waiting for the camera flash, as if he'd just scored the headline he needed to flip the story. Jasmine Crockett exposed as no better than Santos. But Jasmine didn't take the bait. She didn't defend. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward ever so slightly, and a slow, deliberate smile curled on her lips. Not to entertain, but to disarm. It was the smile of someone who knew the truth, and more importantly, had nothing to hide. When she spoke, her tone was measured and impossibly clear, like a bell rung in a quiet room. "Yes," she said plainly, "I have accepted PAC contributions. And every dollar I've received is listed in my public filings. Anyone with a computer and an internet connection can look it up in under 30 seconds. She let that truth settle. No rush, no spin. Then came the second part, slower, lower, with a weight that bent the room. "But you, Mr. Santos," she paused, her voice sharpening like the edge of a scalpel, "used the name of a dead man to pay for Botox." The room didn't gasp. They exhaled like someone had just broken a window in a burning house. Even the camera operators involuntarily jerked toward Santos, as if looking to capture the exact moment that truth punctured his last illusion. Botox, not as a joke, not as a jab, but as proof. Proof that while Jasmine had operated within the rules, transparent, accountable, Santos had crawled through loopholes and corpses to fund vanity. And that was the difference. Jasmine didn't just highlight corruption, she humanized it. She dragged it out of spreadsheets and tax codes and held it up to the light. This is what theft looks like. This is where the money went. Not to programs, not to policy, but to needles and skin cream paid for in someone else's name. Santos tried to open his mouth, but the words didn't come. His lips moved, but there was no sound. His lawyer leaned in, but even he seemed unsure of what defense was left. Because there are no good answers when the lie you live by has just been stripped bare, and the one exposing it never had to raise her voice. But sometimes paper isn't enough. Sometimes the truth has to speak for itself. Jasmine knew it. The spreadsheets, the receipts, the photos, they were sharp but abstract. Numbers could always be spun, documents questioned, but a voice was human. A voice could haunt. So without a word, she reached into her folder and pulled out a slim black recorder, the kind used in interviews or closed-door confessions. She didn't wave it for drama. She didn't explain what was coming. She simply placed it on the desk, pressed play, and leaned back in her chair. Quiet, calm, surgical. The room, already tense, braced itself. Then came the voice. Male, young, tired. His words came slow, unpolished. Not the voice of a politician, not a rehearsed statement. This was something raw, something real. He said, every dead name is a live vote. You just have to make it look clean. The sentence hung in the air like poison. You could feel the collective shift, the involuntary recoil. But the voice kept going. I kept the books. I saw the lists. I printed the forms. I remember thinking, this doesn't feel right. But he told me it was normal. Everyone does it. We needed to win. That's what he said. So I stayed quiet. I regret it now. There was no music, no editing, just silence between each sentence. And that silence did more damage than shouting ever could. It wasn't just what the voice said. It was how he said it. No anger, no panic, just exhaustion. Like someone who had carried a lie for too long and was finally letting it fall. The tone was unmistakable. I was there, I helped, and now I can't unsee it. The impact was instant. No one moved. Aides froze mid-note. Reporters sat, pens idle in their hands. Even the chairwoman's usually blank expression cracked into something closer to disbelief. It wasn't just testimony. It was confession from inside the house Santos built, and Jasmine hadn't said a single word. Santos stared at the recorder like it might start speaking again. His face, once smug and polished, had gone pale. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. There were no objections, no accusations of forgery. Because the voice didn't need defense, it sounded true. And in a room built on political performance, that kind of unfiltered truth was almost unbearable. What Jasmine had just done was more than introduce evidence. She had pierced the illusion. All the deflection, all the denial, all the whataboutism, none of it could outrun the sound of someone on the inside saying, "We knew, we did it, and it was wrong." The hearing chamber was silent, not out of respect, not out of shock, but because something sacred had just happened. Something rare. Someone had spoken plainly, without agenda, without spin. And in that stillness, something else became clear. Jasmine wasn't just confronting a scandal. She was dismantling a system of silence, piece by piece, lie by lie, voice by voice. But even after the silence, after the voice of a broken staffer echoed through the room like a final breath, Jasmine wasn't done. She hadn't come just to expose numbers or even confessions. She came to put a face to the fraud, a soul to the theft. And now it was time to give the dead their voice back. She reached for a single envelope, off-white, worn at the corners, addressed in shaky handwriting. Not digital, not printed. Human. She held it with both hands, gently, like something sacred. Then she looked up, not at Santos, not at the committee, but at the cameras, at the country watching, and only then did she begin to read. My name is Ellen McMillan. I'm the daughter of Leonard H. McMillan, a retired Army medic who served in Vietnam. My father died in 2019 after a long battle with Parkinson's and cancer. both linked to his service. He was a quiet man. He never asked for credit, never expected attention, but he believed in honor. He believed that your name meant something, even after you were gone. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. She read each word like it was carved in stone. Last week, I received a call from your committee. I was told that my father's name was used to donate $8,400 to George Santos's campaign. I was stunned. Then I was sick. Because that donation didn't come from us. We don't have that kind of money. And my father would never have given a cent to a man like that. Her eyes briefly scanned the chamber. Cold, unmoved. Santos sat stiff now. Not defiant, not arrogant, still. This isn't just about a number in a spreadsheet, Jasmine continued. This is about dignity, about what it means when a man gives his life to this country, and then, after death, is used like a prop by someone who never earned his trust, his sacrifice, or his name. Then came the line that broke the room in two. My father was a veteran, a husband, a man of principle. The fact that his name was stolen, desecrated, and used to serve a liar is the greatest insult I have ever witnessed. He deserved better. We all do. Jasmine closed the letter slowly. She didn't fold it. She didn't slam it down. She set it on the table like a flag being lowered at half-mast. Her fingers lingered on it for just a second longer, and then she looked across the table, directly into Santos's eyes. This time, he didn't look back. The man who had smirked, laughed, and deflected for hours suddenly seemed very small. His chin dropped, shoulders slumped inward. His hands, once animated, now clasped tightly together as if gripping something invisible. His story, maybe. His defense. But there was nothing left to hold. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. For the first time in the entire hearing, George Santos went completely silent, because there is no rebuttal to a daughter mourning the desecration of her father's name. The camera zoomed in, catching the flicker of emotion he tried to hide behind lowered eyes. The press gallery scribbled with urgency, but no one dared whisper. Even the chairwoman, battle-hardened by years of political war, sat still. The room was no longer a courtroom. It was a gravesite. And the woman standing at its center wasn't just a lawmaker. She was a eulogist for stolen legacies. And in that moment, every lie Santos had told, every fake donor, every forged record, collapsed under the weight of that letter. Jasmine straightened her papers. Her voice returned, steady and calm, but colder than before. There's a difference, she said quietly, between breaking a rule and breaking a person. She paused. Let it breathe. You didn't just cheat a system, Mr. Santos. You robbed the dead. You took the silence of a veteran and turned it into a receipt. You didn't just commit fraud, you committed erasure. Santos didn't move. There were no more snide remarks, no clever jabs. The room had finally, undeniably turned. And not because Jasmine had yelled, not because she demanded power, but because she had shown what it looks like when someone fights not just with facts, but with honor. Every room has a turning point, and in room 241, it wasn't when Santos was caught. It was when the man he stole from, long gone, finally had someone speak for him, someone who refused to let his name be lost in numbers, someone who understood that integrity is not just about winning, it's about remembering who we owe. And Jasmine Crockett never forgot. Of all the silence that day, none was heavier than the one that followed the letter. But Jasmine knew silence was never enough, not when truth was gasping for air in a room built to suppress it. She rose slowly from her seat, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the quiet authority of someone who had carried the burden of injustice long before this hearing, and would likely carry it long after. Her hands remained by her sides. Her expression didn't shift, but the entire room seemed to reorient around her as she turned, not to Santos, not to the committee, but to the sea of eyes beyond the bench. The press, the public, the cameras blinking red like watchful sentinels. The world. And then she spoke. Not into the mic, but through it. Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang. Clean, deliberate, impossible to tune out. This is not revenge, she said, the words cutting through the air like stone on glass. Let me be clear. I did not spend months gathering records, hearing from whistleblowers, sitting with grieving families, just to punish one man. That's not what this is. She stepped forward once, not for effect, but as if her feet were pulled forward by the weight of what she had to say. This is about something bigger. It's about why a man like George Santos felt safe enough to do what he did, and why so many believed he would get away with it. She turned slightly, just enough to face the wall of photographers, dozens of lenses staring back like unblinking eyes. Her gaze didn't waver. When we allow fraud to become strategy, when we allow lies to become branding, when we allow theft to become survival, then what we're protecting isn't democracy. It's a shadow of it, an illusion, one that serves power, not people. She looked to the committee next. Men and women in suits, some stone-faced, some shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, as if they too had felt the sting of truth. If we cannot expose corruption in this room, she said slowly, where the facts are clear, where the evidence is irrefutable, where even the dead cry out from the margins of a spreadsheet, then what hope is there for the people outside these walls? The ones without lawyers, without cameras, without titles. She let the pause breathe. No one interrupted. No one could. Our democracy isn't dying because of one fraud. It's decaying because we keep pretending the decay doesn't exist, because we confuse civility with silence, and we reward manipulation with airtime. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Santos, still slouched, still silent, and then back to the room. So no, this is not about vengeance. This is about clarity. This is about drawing a line between the truth and the performance, between public service and personal gain, between a woman who spent her life chasing justice and a man who spent his chasing applause. Another step forward. The room felt smaller now. If we let this moment pass, if we close these folders, turn off these mics, and return to business as usual, then we're telling every future fraud that the worst thing they'll face is discomfort, not consequence. The tension in the room was no longer just legal, it was moral. And if that's the system we choose to protect, she said, voice tightening, then don't be surprised when the people outside this building stop believing in it, stop trusting it, stop participating in it, because the rot always begins from within. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She declared, I still believe in democracy, she finished, but I believe in the kind that tells the truth, the kind that protects the living and the dead, and the kind that knows the difference between justice and denial. And then, as if the room itself had been holding its lungs, a long collective breath seemed to release. Not applause, not outcry, just stillness, respectful, awakened. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a reminder that in a nation exhausted by noise, the truth, when spoken plainly, still has the power to shake the walls. The echoes of Jasmine's words had barely faded when the shift began. Subtle at first, but irreversible. While the hearing technically continued, everyone in the room knew the verdict had already been rendered. Not by the committee, but by the court of public truth. Staffers stared down at their phones, eyes widening as live feeds from Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok exploded in real time. On the trending bar, 2 hashtags surged like twin shockwaves. Liar Unmasked and Crockett 241. One was a reckoning. The other, a movement. Clips of Jasmine's calm, dismantling of Santos's lies spread like wildfire, stitched with captions like, "This is how you speak truth to power," and "She didn't raise her voice, she raised the stakes." Inside chambers and Senate offices, phones buzzed relentlessly. Texts poured in, DMS stacked up. Not just from activists or the press, but from ordinary people, teachers, veterans, young voters, even disillusioned cynics who had long stopped believing anyone in government could still stand for something real. Jasmine's words weren't just heard, they were felt. And they weren't just about Santos. They were about a system that had allowed him to exist. Back in room 241, the temperature had changed. A quiet tension filled the space, as if everyone was waiting for someone to move. But no one dared. Jasmine had taken her seat again, still composed, still unshaken. But the air around her now felt different. She no longer looked like a lone figure standing against the tide. She was the tide. One of the senior representatives on the oversight committee leaned slightly toward his colleague and whispered, barely audible, "She just did what no one in our party had the guts to do." His words weren't bitter. They were reverent, resigned even, as though watching someone else live out the conviction he once hoped he had. The colleague beside him gave the smallest nod, their eyes still fixed on Jasmine. And across the room, Santos sat frozen, no longer leaning, no longer smirking, just still. His eyes locked on the empty space in front of him, jaw clenched. Whatever calculations had kept him arrogant for months, whatever delusions had fueled his rise, had finally hit a wall. His silence was no longer a strategy. It was surrender. Behind him, two Capitol police officers stood quietly by the exit. Their posture was unchanged, but their fingers, once relaxed, were now curled with tension at their sides. One adjusted the clasp on his radio. The other shifted his weight slightly forward, just enough to signal readiness. Not aggression, containment. And the irony? The hearing wasn't even officially adjourned. But it didn't matter. The tide had turned, and everyone in the room could feel it pressing against their ribs. This was no longer about procedures. It was about perception. And perception had already become reality. In the hallway outside, reporters had begun rehearsing their closing stand-ups. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett just redefined the word oversight and possibly the balance of power. Today's hearing will be remembered not for what was asked, but for what was exposed. The fallout from room 241 could shift the needle in both parties and possibly open a door no one can close again. Jasmine hadn't intended to launch a movement. She intended to tell the truth. But when truth is spoken clearly, in a room designed to muffle it, it does something dangerous. It spreads. Inside the chamber, the tension was not just political. It was spiritual. A reckoning had taken place. Not the dramatic kind with shouting and gavel pounding, but the kind that lingers in people's bones. The kind they carry home. The kind that rewires how they see power. George Santos didn't raise his eyes, because the world no longer needed to hear from him. They had already heard from someone who mattered. And like all storms, even this one had to end. Not with thunder, but with the stillness left in its wake. The gavel came down, not in triumph, but in closure. 3 hard knocks against wood. "This hearing is adjourned," the chairwoman said flatly. No one moved. No one exhaled. The room felt frozen in amber, like history had happened, and everyone present knew it, but didn't know how to re-enter the present moment. There was no clapping, no shouts, no triumphant soundtrack, just silence thick as grief. The kind of silence that follows something sacred being broken and something necessary being revealed. George Santos didn't rise immediately. He remained in his chair, his back slightly hunched, eyes glued to the space ahead of him, like he was trying to disappear into it. The weight of what had unfolded pressed down on his shoulders, finally forcing him into something close to humility, or at least its shadow. 2 Capitol police officers stepped beside him, not aggressive, not cold, but firm. One leaned in and said something, low, inaudible to the room. Santos nodded slowly. No resistance, no last quip, just the slow movements of a man who had run out of rope. He stood, but not with the practiced posture of the man who once spun fantasies on cable news. He stood like a man carrying every lie he'd ever told on his spine. His steps were unsteady, his jaw clenched. And though the cameras followed him, they did so not like paparazzi chasing a star, but like coroners documenting a fall. No one called his name. No one yelled questions. Even the reporters knew. This was no longer a spectacle. It was a reckoning. As Santos reached the threshold of the room, he turned for half a second, glancing back, not at anyone, but at the space he had occupied. His empty chair, the stack of evidence still spread out like a crime scene, the quiet figure of Jasmine Crockett calmly organizing her folders. Whatever flicker passed through his face, it wasn't anger. It wasn't even shame. It was the look of a man who finally realized that power doesn't protect you when the truth stands taller than the lies you built it on. The doors opened and he walked out, not with glory, but with gravity. No applause, No cameras flashing, just the sound of his footsteps fading down the corridor. Inside, Jasmine remained. She didn't glance up. She didn't bask. She didn't even adjust her posture. Instead, she methodically closed each folder, sliding pages back into place with quiet precision, like a surgeon cleaning up after an operation no one else was qualified to perform. She didn't need an audience. Her work wasn't performance. It was protection. Of truth, of names, of the people who never got to sit at this table. One by one, she placed the folders into her leather case, the buckles snapping shut like punctuation marks. She stood slowly, adjusted her blazer, and reached for her notes. But then, her eyes landed on the chair at the far end of the table, the one Santos had just left. She paused. The seat was still slightly pulled back, the leather darkened by sweat. A ring of dampness marked where his body had rested, tense, unraveling. It was nothing more than moisture, but it told the story that even the boldest lie breaks under pressure, that even the most polished fiction sweats in the presence of truth. Jasmine didn't touch it. She didn't speak. She just stared at it for one quiet second longer, not to gloat, but to remember. Behind her, one camera crew remained, assigned to capture final visuals for the evening newscasts. As Jasmine walked past them, the cameraman instinctively shifted his lens toward the hallway, tracking her movement with a slow pan. But just before she vanished into the corridor, the lens caught something else. Something simple, easy to miss, yet impossible to ignore. Mounted beside the hearing room door, in official black and gold print, was the standard government plaque, Oversight Committee, Room 241. But directly beneath it, taped there by someone unknown, hastily but deliberately, was a narrow strip of white masking tape. On it, written in black marker with imperfect strokes, was a line that hadn't been approved by any office, a line that didn't belong to any rulebook, and yet somehow it said everything that needed to be said, where truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. The camera zoomed in, held for 3 seconds, and clicked off. Outside, the Capitol dome stood still against the gray sky. Somewhere the city moved on. Cars rolled down Constitution Avenue, aides returned to their inboxes, headlines were already being typed. But inside room 241, something had changed. Not in law, not in policy, but in tone, in courage, in the understanding that truth doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits down, and refuses to leave. And when it's done, it leaves behind a silence that even liars can't speak through. The gavel fell like a final heartbeat, but the silence it left behind didn't linger for long. Because while the hearing ended in room 241, the tremor it unleashed began to spread, relentless, unstoppable, and unlike anything the Hill had seen in years. It started in whispers. Capitol staffers outside the chamber frantically texted updates to their bosses. "You need to see what just happened." Within minutes, entire newsrooms paused their pre-scripted rundowns and pivoted in real time. Producers yelled across control rooms. Senior anchors ripped out earpieces mid-broadcast to get the raw footage from room 241. One clip, a 47-second video of Jasmine reading Ellen McMillan's letter, was uploaded by a freelance photographer at 5:17 p.m. By 5:32, it had 1.2 million views. By 6:45, it had reached 10 million. The hashtags began to rise like sirens. Number CROCKET 241, a symbol of reckoning. Liar unmasked, a digital headstone for Santos's career. Commentators were caught off guard, not by the content, but by the tone. Jasmine hadn't grandstanded. She hadn't shouted. She had simply told the truth. And in a political climate addicted to volume, her restraint hit harder than rage ever could. TikTok was a firestorm. Young creators filmed stitched reactions of themselves watching the clip and then falling into stunned silence. Some cried. One teacher wrote, "I watched her do what I've wanted someone to do my whole adult life. Hold the powerful accountable, calmly, with receipts." On Reddit, a comment floated to the top with 45,000 upvotes in 3 hours. She didn't go viral. She went vital. Late-night writers rushed to rewrite their openings. Cable hosts abandoned interviews to run back-to-back clips. Trevor Noah's old production team, now running a satirical political YouTube show, called it the most devastating silence in government since Nixon. Even Fox News was split. One host fumed about performance politics, while another admitted live, "You don't have to agree with her, but you can't deny she brought facts and fire." But in the marble halls of Congress, the reaction was colder, quieter, more dangerous. Behind closed doors, leadership meetings grew tense. Senate chiefs whispered of optics disasters. Some worried aloud, "She's uncontainable now." Donor coalitions sent veiled warnings. Think tanks floated op-eds accusing her of emotional manipulation. But no one could deny the truth. Jasmine Crockett had crossed a line they all saw, but none dared acknowledge. She had pierced the veil. She had made power feel vulnerable. In her office, Jasmine sat alone. The world outside her door was roaring, but inside there was only stillness. Her folders were neatly closed. Her inbox buzzed endlessly on her monitor, unread. Her phone flashed with missed calls from news outlets, activists, colleagues, even a senator who once called her overly idealistic. She didn't move. Her hands rested on the desk, fingers lightly touching. She wasn't paralyzed. She wasn't savoring the moment. She was simply breathing. Because what she had done in room 241 wasn't theater. It was war. A war of memory, of principle, of names and signatures and receipts printed in the shadow of institutions built to forget. Her chief of staff, Dana, finally knocked and pushed the door open halfway. She looked like someone who had just run 3 floors without blinking. "They all want you," Dana said, holding up the phone. "Tapper, Reed, PBS, Colbert's people emailed. TikTok influencers are making remix videos of your closing lines. There's already a petition to rename Room 241. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't smile. Dana walked in, lowered her voice. "Jessa, they're not just calling you brave. They're calling you the last adult in the room." Jasmine looked at her hands. Then quietly, "I didn't do this to be a symbol. I did it because no one else would say his name." Dana's voice softened. "And you did. So now the world's listening." Jasmine finally stood, straightened her blazer. Her eyes met Dana's. "Call Tapper. I'll do PBS after. No Colbert yet. I'm not ready to be the punchline of a broken country." Dana gave a breath of relief. "You got it." As Dana stepped out, Jasmine walked to the window. The Capitol dome gleamed beneath the setting sun. But it didn't look noble. It looked heavy. She saw the reflection of herself in the glass. Eyes tired, shoulders squared, jaw locked like steel. A woman who didn't yell to be heard. A woman who didn't rise to power. She walked through fire to claim it. And as the sun dipped lower, a single sentence replayed in her mind. Not something she said, but something Ellen Macmillan had written. "My father believed that your name meant something, even after you were gone." Jasmine closed her eyes. That's why she had come to room 241. Not to win, not to punish, but to protect the names of people who would never get to sit at that table. And now the world finally knew her own. The applause never came, and Jasmine never expected it would. Not from the machine, not from the marble-lined corridors that mistook silence for civility. The truth, when spoken too clearly, never won the room, but it always woke the architects of denial. It began with a whisper. A leaked memo circulated among conservative donors by dawn, titled "Crockett's Grandstand, a Threat to Institutional Trust." The message wasn't subtle. It was a call to arms. Within hours, cable networks picked up the phrase. Panelists who had once ignored the hearing now spoke with urgent conviction. What Crockett did was not oversight. It was theater. One anchor, squinting into the camera, warned viewers that this new style of emotionalized accountability could destroy respectful discourse. Another added, "She didn't cross a line, she erased it." By noon, the retaliation had a face. Clips of the hearing, carefully edited and misleading, flooded social media. Jasmine's calm pauses were cut to look like hesitation. Her evidence displays were labeled staged. One video showed her reading the veteran's daughter's letter, but overdubbed with dramatic music, mocking subtitles, and the caption, Oscar performance from a race hustler. The smear campaign was swift, coordinated, and vicious, but the real damage crept behind the cameras. A prominent D.C. law firm canceled a criminal justice forum she was slated to keynote. The email was short, apologetic, and full of euphemisms. In light of recent developments, our advisory board has decided to take a step back from highly politicized figures. A telecom lobbyist, once a cautious donor, called Dana privately. "Tell her to lower the flame," he said. "There's a difference between being right and being useful." But the worst betrayal didn't come from opponents. It came from within. In a closed-door committee huddle, one centrist colleague murmured loud enough to be heard, "She made it harder for the rest of us to play the game." Another, more blunt, "If she wants to be Joan of Arc, she better be ready to burn." And yet, Jasmine didn't blink. She went to work. Every morning, 6 a.m. sharp. Files, names, footnotes, more whistleblowers reaching out, more watchdogs volunteering data. While the world tried to reduce her to a meme, too angry, too loud, too black, she doubled down on precision. They expected outrage. What they got was strategy. She didn't tweet. She didn't lash out. She didn't tour the talk shows. Instead, she quietly requested transcripts from 4 past hearings, 3 involving misused PACs, 1 with a mysteriously buried audit report from 2019. She read them like a surgeon reviewing post-op complications, because she knew one thing. If they were going to punish her for lifting the curtain, she might as well tear down the entire stage. And then, 3 days later, it arrived. A plain envelope, no postage, no return address. Left on the floor just outside her office before sunrise. Inside, a photo of her parents standing outside their house in Texas. It wasn't public. It wasn't from social media. Jasmine recognized it instantly. It had been taken from her phone during a private holiday trip. The back of the photo was blank, but beneath it, tucked behind the image, was a narrow strip of paper. Folded once. On it, typed in bold courier font, were just 2 things: a date, an address, no threat, no words, just a message. "We're watching." Dana found it first. She froze. "We need to call security," she said. Jasmine stared at the paper for a long time. Not in fear, not in panic, in something colder, cleaner. "No," she said. "That's what they want. They want noise. They want chaos. They want me reactive." Dana stepped closer. "Then what do we do?" Jasmine slowly folded the paper, slipped it into a manila envelope, and wrote on it with a Sharpie, "Confession 1." She looked up. "We don't flinch," she said. "We document, and then we keep going." Because what her enemies didn't understand was that Jasmine Crockett didn't come to Congress to be liked. She didn't come to perform. She came to account. And when the system blinked, she stared right back. It was well past midnight. Washington had gone to sleep, or at least pretended to. The traffic lights blinked red over empty intersections. Lobbyists had retreated to their cocktail bars. Reporters were finally off air, writing their next headlines or erasing them, depending on how the wind blew. The city was silent, but inside the Capitol, room 241 was still awake. Jasmine Crockett walked its halls alone. Not for a photo op, not for strategy, just to return to the place where something cracked open, something too large to be contained in a viral clip. Her heels echoed softly against the marble floors. The lights had dimmed for energy saving, casting long shadows across the corridor. Paintings of dead men in dark suits watched her pass, their eyes forever frozen in time, unable to understand the woman moving between their legacies. She didn't hurry. Every step toward room 241 felt measured, like a soldier returning to a battlefield after the smoke has cleared. Not to relive the battle, to understand the silence that came after. And then, she was there. The door to the Oversight Committee chamber was shut, but the wall beside it still bore the plaque. Oversight Committee, Room 241, United States House of Representatives. But it wasn't the plaque she looked at. It was what sat beneath it. A strip of white painter's tape, slightly weathered at the corners, edges curled like old paper. Still stuck, still legible, still untouched, and scrawled across it in bold black marker, uneven but defiant, were the words, "Where truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." She stood there for a moment, then another, then another, not reading it, but feeling it, like it had been carved not into the wall, but into her chest. Behind her came footsteps, slow, measured, familiar. "Still can't sleep either?" came a voice, dry and gravelly. She turned and found Representative Walter Carter walking toward her. Navy blue suit, slightly wrinkled. No tie. Just a lanyard badge and eyes that had seen far too many battles. Not on a screen, but in jungles that never made it into textbooks. He was old school, a war vet, the kind of man who used to believe politics was about honor before realizing Washington had a different definition. "I'm surprised you're still here," Jasmine said softly. Carter shrugged. "Capitol's quieter after midnight. That's when you hear the building breathe." He joined her by the plaque and looked at the tape. "You know who wrote that?" he asked. "I don't," she said. "Ellis," he said with a nod. "Custodian. Been here longer than half the people whose names are on those office doors. Said he watched your hearing from a tablet on the janitor's bench outside. When it was over, he walked in, cleaned the floors, and left that behind." Jasmine stared at the words again. Something in her chest ached, not from pain, but from recognition. Carter continued. "He didn't tell anyone. Didn't ask permission. Hell, didn't even spell check. But he said he had to leave something. Because what happened in that room?" He paused. It reminded him of the first time he heard Dr. King speak live. Said your voice hit the same part of him. The air shifted. Jasmine closed her eyes for half a second. "It wasn't supposed to be history," she said. "It was supposed to be accountability." "Sometimes," Carter said, "they're the same thing." He looked at her fully now. "I've been here 38 years, long enough to see when people pretend to change things, and long enough to know when someone actually does. You didn't just expose a fraud, Crockett. You scared the system." She didn't respond, so he leaned closer. "And scared systems retaliate, but you already know that, don't you?" Jasmine nodded. "They've started, quietly, behind closed doors, canceled speaking events, frozen invitations, anonymous letters left at my office door. One had a photo of my family." Carter's jaw tightened. "Then they're afraid? That's good. That means you're still in the fight." "But what if it's not enough?" Jasmine asked. "What if I pulled the curtain back, and all it does is teach them to hang thicker curtains next time?" He smiled sadly, but not without hope. "Maybe, or maybe, you just gave someone watching the courage to pull the next one." They stood there together in front of the wall, neither of them speaking, just the hum of old air vents and flickering lights. Finally, Jasmine took a breath and said, "They'll remove the tape." Carter gave a knowing chuckle. "Probably tomorrow, maybe tonight." "Then I'll write it again," she said. "And if they scrape that off, I'll etch it. And if they paint over that, I'll say it so loud they won't need walls to remember." Carter looked at her one last time, eyes filled with a mix of admiration and grief. "Just don't burn yourself down trying to light the way." Jasmine smiled softly. "I've already been burned. That's why I know how to carry flame without dropping it." With that, Carter nodded, turned, and walked slowly down the corridor until his steps disappeared into the darkness. Jasmine remained. Her fingers reached out, not to pull the tape off or straighten it, just to touch it, lightly, as if the wall itself had become part of her story, and maybe it had. She closed her eyes and whispered to the stone, "I hear you. I still hear you." Because in a building designed to outlast truth, sometimes the boldest thing you can do is leave a message no one dares to erase. As Jasmine's whisper faded into the stone, and the hallway returned to stillness, one truth remained clearer than ever. This was never just about one man or one hearing. It was about what we choose to protect when no one is watching. The story of Jasmine Crockett was never the story of a courtroom, or a committee room, or even room 241. It was the story of how power reacts when it's cornered by clarity. It was about a woman who refused to play by the rules of polite corruption, and instead asked, what if we didn't accept the lie as the price of admission? That question didn't just shake Santos. It shook the scaffolding that had held up his kind for decades. Because when someone like Jasmine stands up with nothing but facts, memory, and a voice that doesn't flinch, the system doesn't just hear her, it feels threatened by her. And that is the real lesson. That the truth doesn't just reveal injustice, it exposes who's benefiting from it. But there's a darker layer, one that doesn't make the newsreels or the viral cuts. It's this. People like Jasmine are not just resisted, they're punished. Not with chains or gags, but with silence, sabotage, and exile. When you embarrass power, it doesn't strike back with thunder. It whispers behind your back. It pulls funding. It cancels panels. It calls you divisive while inviting the fraud back to the table. Jasmine wasn't lifted on shoulders after that hearing. She walked out alone. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right too soon for their comfort. And that's the human cost of telling the truth in a room full of people who've made peace with distortion. There's a cruel irony at play. George Santos told lies so big, so reckless, they became armor. And Jasmine told a truth so careful, so restrained, it became a threat. That is the imbalance that haunts our institutions. We reward audacity even when it's hollow. We punish integrity, especially when it's sharp. But every generation needs someone who walks into the lion's den without a sword, only receipts, and says, "I'm not here to play chess with your lies. I'm here to flip the board." Jasmine flipped the board, and in doing so, she reminded us of something most people forget. Justice isn't loud, it's relentless. The lesson isn't just political, it's personal. How many of us have stayed silent in rooms where lies were dressed in suits? How many times have we chosen safety over honesty, knowing the cost of speaking might be our seat at the table? Jasmine didn't just choose to speak, she chose to be heard, even if it meant never being invited back. That is courage, not in theory, in practice. And it's a courage that demands something from the rest of us, to decide whether we clap from the sidelines or carry the torch forward when the lights fade. There's a young woman somewhere watching Jasmine and thinking, if they tried to erase her and failed, maybe I don't have to shrink. There's a tired father working a night shift who sees her and thinks, maybe truth isn't just for the rich and the safe anymore. That ripple, that quiet, defiant belief that truth can still mean something, is the lesson Jasmine left behind. And no committee can redact that. No smear campaign can delete it. Because once truth has a name and a face and a voice, it's no longer abstract. It's contagious. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this. Jasmine didn't win that day by defeating Santos. She won by revealing that he was never the disease. He was a symptom. The real sickness is a system that protects its own rot, so long as it smiles in the mirror. And if that's the case, then Jasmine's greatest act wasn't prosecution. It was provocation. She provoked a country to ask, how many more are hiding behind the rules they wrote? So here's what we take with us. We learn that silence may be safe, but it is never sacred. That laws can be twisted, but names cannot be stolen forever. That every hearing, every chair, every empty leather seat still holding the warmth of the accused, they're not just symbols, they're reminders. Reminders that this system was built by people, and it can be rebuilt by people. And when we rebuild it, we must ask, will we design it to protect the powerful or to empower the truthful? Because in the end, the most radical act isn't shouting, it's refusing to look away. And Jasmine Crockett didn't look away. She looked through the lies and made the world look with her. That's the kind of story that doesn't end. It echoes. And if we're brave enough, it becomes our own. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In less than 5 minutes on live television, Bill Maher tried to corner Jasmine Crockett with jokes, mockery, and one brutal question. If you're this sensitive, why are you in politics? But what happened next stunned his entire studio. Jasmine raised the standard, delivering a response that flipped the entire conversation. So what exactly did Jasmine say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The email hit Jasmine's inbox just after 6 a.m. Subject, Invitation to Real Time with Bill Mayer. Segment on free speech and cancel culture. No warmth, no context, just a sterile block of text. We'd love to have Congresswoman Crockett join us for a spirited discussion. Spirited. She read it twice. It wasn't an invite. It was bait. She tossed the phone onto the counter. Maher didn't want a conversation. He wanted a spectacle. By 8 a.m., she sat in her campaign office, blazer crisp, coffee untouched. Reese stood in the doorway, invite in hand. They're not calling you to speak. They're calling you to fall. Jasmine didn't blink. She stared at the screen behind him. Cancel culture, like crosshairs. Push back. They'll cut your mic. Stay quiet. They'll call you weak, Reese warned. Not paranoia, pattern. She turned to the window, watching sunlight stretch across her city. If I say no, they'll say I'm scared. If I say yes, they'll come for blood. Then she turned, calm and clear. Let them. If it's a mind game they want, I'll play, and I'll win. She paused. Book it. She didn't flinch when she said it. Book it. But when the car turned off Fairfax Avenue and slipped behind the gates of CBS Television City, Jasmine felt the change in the air. Not nerves, not fear, just that thick, invisible pressure she knew too well. The kind that follows you when you walk into a room knowing you weren't invited to be heard, only to be handled. From the back seat, she watched the building rise out of the dusk like a monolith. Clean, glossy, impressive, but cold. As the car stopped, the silence inside felt louder than the LA traffic outside. She stepped out, heels striking concrete with calm precision, not for show, but as a reminder, to herself and anyone watching, that she didn't come to play their game quietly. Inside, the hallway was eerily still. No laughter, no greetings, no assistant rushing forward with a clipboard. Just a long stretch of fluorescent light and polished tile that reflected her every step like a spotlight without warmth. Her arrival wasn't acknowledged, just logged. A silent intern gave her a nod. No name, no smile, and pointed vaguely down the hallway. She walked, eyes sharp, catching glimpses of camera gear and stagehands pretending not to see her. Then came the sound. Laughter, loud, familiar, performative. It leaked through a half-open door, and when she glanced over, she saw him. Dalton Briggs, white, loud, smug, a conservative commentator who built his brand laughing at people like her, not with them. And now he was laughing again, with producers, with staff, with comfort. One of them touched his shoulder as if they'd known each other for years. Someone handed him a cappuccino. His mic was already clipped on. Jasmine entered her own green room. No producers, no coffee, no prep. Just a folding chair beside a crooked side table and a lukewarm bottle of water that had already begun to sweat. There was no welcome, just walls, white, blank, and soundproof. It was quiet in a way that didn't soothe. It excluded. It said, "You're the outsider here. Don't forget it." She looked at the mirror. It didn't flatter. It didn't lie. And she didn't need it to. Her hair was already perfect. Her blazer, a soft navy with structured shoulders, sat on her like armor. She didn't come for decoration. She came for war, if that's what they wanted. She sat without slouching. No scrolling through her phone, no pacing, just stillness and observation. Every moment was a message. She could see the setup already. When she entered that stage, they'd expect her to be tense, defensive, cold. The camera wouldn't pan to her until the first jab had been thrown, and then it would linger, hoping she'd flinch. That was the real set design, unwritten but deliberate. Silence wasn't absence. It was the first act of control. Her fingers moved slowly, brushing a thread from her lapel that wasn't even there. Then she exhaled, low and steady, and murmured a line she'd said to herself in dozens of rooms just like this. But this time it rang heavier, like steel drawn in a quiet room. "I didn't come here to be comfortable," she whispered. "I came here to be right." The studio lights snapped on like a switchblade, warm to the audience but glaring to the guests. Jasmine stepped onto the stage without flinching, her heels steady against the polished floor, her blazer catching just enough of the light to remind them she came prepared, not styled. She took her seat, nodded once, and let her gaze sweep calmly across the room. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. She'd studied this terrain long before tonight. She knew which cameras stayed wide, which ones lingered when a guest hesitated, and more importantly, she knew exactly what this crowd expected her to be: reactive, defensive, and too easy to rattle. She wasn't going to give them that, not tonight. The applause sign flashed. The crowd responded with robotic rhythm, and Bill Maher leaned forward in his chair, like a man about to set a trap he thought no one else could see. His voice had that trademark smirk woven into it, half laugh, half lecture, the tone of someone who mistakes cynicism for insight. Joining us tonight, he began, is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the bold, unfiltered face of a new political wave. You might recognize her as the poster child for the generation that cancels everything but their own outrage. Laughter erupted, polite and sharp. It wasn't joy, it was approval. That familiar, smug approval of a room that had already decided which side it was on before the conversation had even begun. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She didn't smile because they were laughing. She smiled because she knew exactly why they were. Her smile wasn't for them. It was armor. Her eyes locked on Mayor's, and in that single look was a message. I know what you're doing, and I came ready. She adjusted her posture, lifted her chin a fraction, and responded not with volume, but with precision. Or maybe, she said, voice like a steady tide, I represent the generation that's done being quiet while everyone else gets to rewrite the rules and call it progress. The silence was instant, cold, dense. It wasn't just that the crowd stopped laughing, it was that they hadn't expected to be spoken to like that. The rules of the game had shifted mid-play. Mar blinked once, that smug curve at the corner of his mouth softening ever so slightly, as if some part of him realized she wasn't there to provide good television. She was there to tell the truth, and she didn't need their permission to do it. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't lean back or pile on. She simply folded her hands, crossed one leg over the other, and waited. Still. Controlled. Like someone who had just walked through the front door of the very fire they built for her, and didn't burn. Meyer recovered quickly. He always did. Like a man used to slipping out of corners he'd painted himself into, he leaned back, fingers steepled, and dropped his next line with deliberate weight. You know, he said, the grin returning like a blade behind glass, it seems like every time someone disagrees with your side, suddenly it's about race, gender, trauma, whatever identity card happens to be most useful that week. A few chuckles scattered through the audience, uneasy but obedient. He pressed on. You call it justice. I call it victim culture. Everyone wants to be the underdog now, because it means no one can challenge them without getting accused of oppression. He shrugged, feigning neutrality, but the venom was unmistakable. It's like disagreement equals bigotry these days, and frankly, that's not discourse. That's emotional blackmail. Jasmine didn't react, not visibly, but something in her eyes changed, the way metal shifts in a forge before it strikes. She held still, every part of her calm, but charged, like the quiet before a thunderclap. She knew this script. She'd heard this line before, dressed up in 100 different suits. This wasn't debate. It was deflection dressed as intellectualism. Maher wasn't asking a question. He was drawing a boundary, one that gave him permission to dismiss any experience he didn't share. She let the silence stretch for a beat too long, just enough to make it uncomfortable, just enough to make him, and the audience, feel the weight of his own words. The tension thickened, not like conflict, but like gravity pulling the moment towards something inevitable. The silence after Maher's comment didn't feel empty. It felt tight, like the whole room had stopped breathing, waiting to see if she'd laugh it off or explode. Jasmine did neither. She sat still, hands calm in her lap, eyes focused. This wasn't new. She'd been in rooms like this before. Rooms where people with power said loaded things and expected her to either smile or shrink. She did neither. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. No anger. Just a truth she'd carried for years. When a system keeps failing the same group of people over and over, she said, Speaking up about it isn't about playing victim. It's about staying alive. The air in the studio shifted. It wasn't a punchback. It was a correction. Clean. Director. Her words didn't bounce. They sank. She looked at Mar. You think people bring up race and gender just to shut down conversations? She tilted her head slightly. We bring them up because those things shape how we're treated. Every day. At work. At the doctor's office. At the polls. She paused just long enough. It's not convenient. It's reality. Mar opened his mouth, then closed it. She didn't wait. In my district, polling places in black neighborhoods get shut down quietly right before elections. People wait 2, sometimes 3 hours just to vote. Some leave, some can't stay because they have to get to work. That's not a complaint. That's the truth. Now she turned to the audience, her tone still calm but firmer. I've sat in meetings where a woman brings up a solid idea and no one responds. 10 minutes later, a man says the exact same thing, and suddenly it's brilliant. She let the silence settle before continuing. You can't tell me that's just coincidence, and you can't tell me pointing it out means we're being sensitive. She looked back at Mayor. You say people today are too quick to cry oppression, but maybe that's just because people like me are finally being heard, and maybe that makes some folks uncomfortable. Her eyes didn't blink. But discomfort isn't oppression either. The room was still. Nobody was laughing now. Jasmine kept her voice steady, almost quiet, but each word landed with force. It's not that we want to talk about race or gender every time. It's that we don't have the luxury not to. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just makes sure it stays broken. Mayor shifted in his seat. For the first time, he looked like he wasn't sure what to say. He reached for his water. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't press. She let the silence do the work. The crowd wasn't clapping, but they weren't breathing either. Finally, she leaned back, not to relax, but to hold her ground. You don't have to agree with me, but you're not going to twist what I lived through into a punchline. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. She wasn't debating anymore. She was setting the terms. And now, for the first time all night, the room belonged to her. The last thing Jasmine said had stripped the air of its usual comfort. No laughter, no sarcasm, just truth. Clean, firm, and echoing. Maher's face held its practiced calm, but his fingers twitched against the edge of the armrest, and that trademark smirk was beginning to look more like a reflex than confidence. He leaned in, but not to listen, to retake control. Look, I'm just asking a question, he said, hands out like he was being reasonable. If you're this easily offended, if just being challenged makes you upset, why are you in politics? This isn't personal therapy. It's public service. A few people in the crowd chuckled, unsure if they were laughing with him or at the trap they saw forming. Maher sat back, confident again, like he'd just won a round. His posture said, gotcha. His eyes said, let's see what she does with that. Jasmine didn't move, not a twitch, not a blink. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was a pause with purpose. She could feel it, the air thickening, the cameras waiting, the audience leaning in for a reaction. But there was no flash of anger, no cutting comeback. Just a breath, deep, even. And then her voice, quiet, precise, the kind of calm that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. The question isn't the problem, she said, eyes locked on his. But the way you ask it, that tells me you've never had your voice taken from you. The room froze. A wave of stillness passed over the studio like a held breath. Not one sound, not one shuffle in a seat. Even the cameras seemed to slow. Jasmine leaned forward now, not aggressively, but with the weight of someone carrying years of unspoken truth. When you've had to fight just to be heard, when your presence in the room feels like a challenge to the people already there, being calm isn't weakness, it's survival. Her words were soft but sharp, each one hitting with surgical precision. I'm not in politics because I bruise easy. I'm here because I've been bruised before, and I'm still standing. I know what it means to have something taken from you before you ever got the chance to speak. Mayor didn't respond, not right away. His hands stilled. The audience didn't laugh. No applause, no cues. Just tension, real and raw, pressing down on everyone equally. And Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't smile. She just let it hang. The silence, the truth, the weight of what was just said. Because in that moment, she didn't win the argument. She changed the rules. The silence still lingered from Jasmine's last line. A silence so complete, it felt like the walls of the studio had leaned in to listen. She had cut through the noise without raising her voice, and in that brief, brutal stillness, she had done something rare on live television. Made the room feel real. But she wasn't done. She shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers lightly brushing her blazer sleeve, as if steadying something inside. Then calmly she said, "Do you want to talk about tone?" "Let's talk about tone." Meher raised an eyebrow, ready to strike, but Jasmine kept going, measured, unwavering, surgical. "3 months ago, I sat through a House oversight hearing. 5 minutes into my opening remarks, I was interrupted 17 times. 17. Her voice didn't tremble. If anything, it was clearer now, like someone describing a crime scene they've walked through 100 times. And when I finally asked, very calmly might I add, to be allowed to finish my sentence, the chairman leaned into his mic and said, "Congresswoman, don't be rude." A murmur ran through the audience, low and uncomfortable. Jasmine let it sit, then added, "You know what's wild? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the table. I didn't even break eye contact. But somehow I was still the problem." Meher chuckled lightly, trying to break the tension. "Well, to be fair, maybe it's not what you said, but how you said it." That line should have sounded harmless, but it hit like a slap. And Jasmine's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. She turned to face him fully now, not combative, not dramatic, just clear, devastatingly clear. "Ah, now I see," she said quietly. "When you speak directly, it's called being sharp. When I speak directly, it's called having an attitude. That's the difference I live with." The audience didn't laugh. They didn't breathe. They just watched, eyes fixed, waiting to see what came next. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. "Let me tell you what that moment in the hearing felt like. Imagine being asked to speak, then told you're too loud the second you do. Imagine watching your male colleagues yell, interrupt, posture, and get praise for being passionate. Then imagine doing none of those things and still being labeled as aggressive. That's not about tone. That's about control." Meher opened his mouth, then closed it. She wasn't done. "I've had my words picked apart more than the content of what I'm saying. I've had people call me angry before I've even opened my mouth. I've had to smile when I'm being talked over, because if I don't, I'm called difficult. I've had to nod politely while being insulted, because if I push back, I'm unprofessional." She paused just long enough for every word to sink in. "And somehow in all of that, I'm still expected to prove I belong in the room." The lights above the stage buzzed faintly, but the audience was still frozen. No applause, no murmurs, just faces that looked like they'd been slapped with reality. Jasmine's tone never wavered. She wasn't performing. She was telling the truth. And truth, when it cuts clean, doesn't need to shout. Meher tried again, this time softer. "But don't you think sometimes people hear you that way because they're not used to being challenged?" Jasmine turned her gaze to him, measured but unblinking. "No," she said plainly. "They hear me that way because they're used to being comfortable. And I don't make them comfortable." She took a breath. "And you know what? That's not my job." Now she looked out at the audience. Not for applause, not for effect. Just to make sure they heard this next part. "My job isn't to fit the mold. My job is to break it. If the mold was designed to silence people who look like me, talk like me, or come from where I come from, I'm not here to be palatable. I'm here to be effective." The crowd was silent. But it wasn't the kind of silence that waits for the next joke. It was the kind of silence that says, "I've never thought about it like that, and now I can't unhear it." Meher sat back in his chair now, arms still crossed, but less sure. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then let it close again. Jasmine didn't flinch. "You say I'm too much?" she said, voice low and steady. "I say for too long, We've been told to be less. Less loud, less direct, less visible, less real. And what has that gotten us? Nothing but the illusion of access, without the substance of power. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer, not as a gesture, but like someone brushing off dust they'd carried for too long. So no, she continued, I won't soften just to make someone else more comfortable. I won't shrink just to stay in the room. I've earned my seat, and I'll speak like someone who has. Then she leaned back, not to rest, but to let the words stand alone. And they did. They stood like steel in the air, unshaken, undeniable. For the first time in the entire interview, Maher looked small, not humiliated, but humbled, because Jasmine hadn't yelled. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't even raised her voice. She just told the truth, calmly, clearly, and without asking permission. The audience still didn't clap, not because they weren't moved, but because it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like something sacred. And sometimes the only right response to something sacred is silence. The silence still hadn't broken. Not truly. It lingered like heat after lightning, thick with everything that had just been said. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, but somehow she had raised the stakes. She wasn't just responding anymore. She was drawing a line. And now, with his usual rhythm disrupted, Maher leaned forward, not to listen, but to take back control. Maher straightened in his chair, his tone tightening like a belt around a slipping argument. Let's not make this about race, he said, trying to sound measured. It's not about your skin color. It's about how we talk to each other. That's what this is about. Civil discourse. Tone. He gestured lightly with one hand, like he was diffusing tension, but Jasmine saw it for what it was. A pivot, a redirection, the same script she'd heard in every polished room where discomfort dressed up as neutrality. But she didn't bite. She didn't lean in or lean back. She just looked at him, steady, like someone staring across a chessboard, 2 moves ahead. When she spoke, it wasn't loud, but it was final. See, she said gently, that's the difference right there. You say it's about how we talk, but real dialogue isn't when one side gets to ask all the questions and the other side has to stay quiet just to avoid being labeled as too sensitive. Her voice didn't shake. If anything, it landed sharper because it didn't need volume. The room exhaled, just barely, and then shifted. You say it's not about race, she continued, her eyes never leaving his. But only one of us keeps getting told to watch their tone. Only one of us is being told that being direct is a problem. Maher opened his mouth, but the audience moved first. A ripple of applause began from the back row. Small, tentative, and grew. This wasn't the kind of clapping that followed a joke. It wasn't forced or performative. It was slow, solid, earned. The kind of applause that didn't say we agree, but we understand now. Jasmine let the sound roll, but didn't ride it. She waited for it to fade before she continued, never losing the thread. This isn't about attacking anyone, she said. It's about naming the pattern. Because if we can't even talk about the double standard, about who gets to be blunt and respected, and who gets labeled difficult for speaking up, then we're not having a conversation. We're just protecting the comfort of the loudest person in the room. The tension was back, but it was different now. It wasn't defensive. It was reflective. You could feel it in the stillness of the crowd, in the way people leaned forward slightly, drawn not by drama, but by truth. Maher tried to salvage it. But don't you think tone matters? I mean how we say things. It changes how people hear us. Jasmine nodded. Sure, tone matters, but only when it's judged equally. And it's not. She held out a hand, open-palmed. When a man interrupts, he's assertive. When I say, please don't interrupt me, I'm combative. Her hand dropped slowly. That's not tone. That's bias. Again, silence. Real silence. Not the kind that falls flat, but the kind that listens. She looked out at the studio, eyes scanning across the lights, the cameras, the watchers behind the glass. We say we want honest conversation, she said, but only if it's comfortable. We say we want different voices at the table, but only if they don't speak too loud or too fast or too real. Her voice dropped, just slightly. That's not dialogue, that's a performance. And I didn't come here to perform. No one moved, not Maher, not the guests, not the crew. The audience sat in a still, focused silence that didn't ask for a follow-up. It demanded reflection. Then Jasmine looked back at Maher, her tone softening just enough to feel human again. You're not the enemy, she said, but sometimes you don't even see the stage you're standing on, because it was built for your voice to carry, built for your jokes to land, built for your discomfort to mean something, and mine to be ignored. Maher blinked, and for the first time that night, said nothing. He sat still, jaw tight, eyes locked on hers. But he didn't challenge her, because he couldn't, because she wasn't fighting. She was explaining, and everyone in the room felt it. Jasmine folded her hands together, her voice gentle now, but unshakably firm. I want real dialogue, but real dialogue means both sides have to be allowed to speak, and be heard, and not be punished for how their truth sounds coming out of their mouth. The lights felt warmer now, the air heavier. Someone in the front row whispered, "That's it," barely audible through the mic. Another person nodded. And just like that, the room didn't feel like a studio anymore. It felt like a reckoning, because Jasmine Crockett had said what so many had felt and never been allowed to say out loud. In that space, under those lights, on that stage. Not without being called angry, or difficult, or too much. But this time, no one dared to call her that. They just listened, because finally it wasn't about winning the exchange. It was about telling the truth and making sure it echoed. Jasmine walked off the set with her spine straight and her silence louder than applause. The studio doors closed behind her, but the fire she lit didn't stay in that room. It ran. Through wires, into servers, onto screens, through fingers, and what started as a single moment became a national echo before she even reached the parking lot. The clip hit the internet less than 20 minutes after airtime. No flashy headline, no celebrity endorsement, just raw footage, 6 seconds long, her face steady, her voice calm, her words cutting through noise like steel through fog. I'm not being small, I'm being clear. It spread like a spark in dry wind. Within hours, it was on every major platform, subtitled, repackaged, reshared by strangers, teenagers, veterans, CEOs college professors. Her line became a headline, then a hashtag, then a movement. By 1 a.m., her name was trending across every platform. Not being small hit #1 on X, followed closely by Wansha Crockett Clarity. Edits of her face, overlaid with quotes, appeared on Instagram Reels. A dozen TikTok creators stitched themselves reacting to the moment, some nodding in disbelief, others in tears. In one clip, a woman in her 60s pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "Finally, someone said it for all of us." But Jasmine? She sat alone in the back seat of a black SUV crawling through downtown Los Angeles, her phone lighting up every 4 seconds, her name ringing from devices she couldn't see. Reese sat beside her, jaw clenched, phone in hand, reading updates as they poured in. CNN wants you in studio tomorrow. Maddow's team is asking for a quote. Fox is calling it the new face of liberal fragility, which for them is probably a compliment. He paused. MSNBC said you cracked the country open. Their words, Jasmine didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed on the city lights outside, her hand resting on the armrest, still. Inside the hotel room, the air was thick, thicker than before the show. The kind of weight that settles when you realize the story isn't in your hands anymore. It's in theirs, on their screens, in their interpretations. Reese turned on the TV. There she was, already. A guest panel on CNN was debating whether Jasmine Crockett had redefined assertiveness or weaponized identity. One commentator called it a masterclass in restraint. Another called it strategic victimhood, masked as clarity. The volume stayed low, but the noise still crept in. She turned it off. Her inbox was a war zone. Dozens of requests in bold subject lines. Today Show interview? Anderson Cooper? The View wants to book you Friday. The offers came with high-profile hosts and higher stakes. But Jasmine scrolled past them all. No response. No reply. Just one sentence to Reese. I'm not doing any of it. He looked up from his phone, confused. None of them? Even the friendlies? She nodded, slow and deliberate. They want a headline. I gave them a boundary. Reese leaned against the desk. You know what comes next if you stay quiet. Yeah, she said. But I know what comes if I start talking, too. The next morning, the split was brutal. The Atlantic ran a piece titled Jasmine Crockett, The New Blueprint for Power. The Federalist countered with why not being small is the new political narcissism. A prominent radio host called her a disruptor with a persecution complex. A podcast dubbed her the woman who brought a scalpel to a shouting match. One op-ed accused her of playing the race card. Another called her the voice we didn't know we needed. But the wildest thing, she hadn't said a word since the taping. And that silence, intentional, razor sharp, became its own statement. The more they talked, the more obvious it became. She didn't need to defend her words. They were still echoing without her. Reese walked into the hotel room midday, holding a coffee and a list. 23 requests, 3 morning shows, 2 Sunday panels, even a call from NPR. Guy says he just wants to talk about posture and presence. She looked at the list once, then shook her head. Let it go quiet. Reese hesitated. You sure? Jasmine finally turned to face him fully, eyes clear. If I speak now, I become part of the spin. I want them to sit with what I already said. No edits, no smiles, no softened edges. He nodded slowly, understanding more than he said out loud. That night, alone in her room, Jasmine watched the city skyline through a window smudged by fog. In the distance, a helicopter hovered, probably media. Below, cars crawled like ants, everyone rushing to the next thing. But she didn't move. She sat with her breath, with the weight, with the knowledge that she'd said something unpolished, unscripted, and entirely too real for a culture addicted to sound bites. She opened her notebook, the same one she kept with her in every campaign. She flipped past policy notes, to-do lists, debates, speeches, and found a blank page. At the top, she wrote one line. They wanted a viral moment. I gave them a mirror. Then she closed the book, not the story, just the chapter, because the story wasn't over. It was just getting harder to control. And for once, that wasn't her problem. It was theirs. Jasmine had turned down the interviews, stepped back from the cameras, and let the echo of her words speak for themselves. What she didn't expect, what no one planned for, was what happened next. When the noise faded and the world began to whisper back in a different voice, it started with an email, simple subject line, from a viewer in Ohio. No staffer had filtered it, no publicist had flagged it. It slipped through the clutter and landed in Jasmine's inbox like a pebble in still water. She clicked. The message was short, just a few lines, but every word landed with the weight of a life lived differently. I've disagreed with you for years. I've rolled my eyes, cursed at my TV, even told my wife you were part of the problem. But when I watched you last night, I didn't see a problem. I saw something I never gave a name to, a woman refusing to bend so the world could stay comfortable. I think I've been wrong. She stared at the screen, not because it surprised her, but because it didn't. Deep down, she'd always believed people could hear truth if it was delivered without apology. And for once, someone had. A few hours later, her chief of staff forwarded a photo from a teacher in Columbus. It showed a teenage girl standing in front of a whiteboard, smiling nervously. Hand-drawn across her sweatshirt in permanent marker were 5 words, uneven but bold. I'm not being small. Below the photo was a caption. She watched your clip, then asked me, is it okay if I wear my voice like armor? Jasmine set the phone down and let her hands fall to her lap. This wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about right or left, cable networks or talking heads. These weren't applause lines. They were reflections, proof that something inside people had shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't come with cheers. It comes with stillness, with the quiet recognition that you've seen something you can't unsee. Not a performance, a recalibration, not a moment, a mirror. And through that mirror, people weren't just looking at her. They were seeing themselves. Some for the first time, some with shame, but more and more, with courage. Jasmine didn't need more noise. She didn't want to be quoted out of context, made into merch, or locked into another broadcast cycle built to monetize outrage. What she wanted now was something quieter, something stronger, something that couldn't be clipped or spun or erased. She wanted people to walk away not just remembering her, but remembering themselves. The door shut with a soft thud as the last staffer entered the room. The glass walls of her Dallas campaign office reflected the late afternoon light like it, too, had been holding its breath all day. Jasmine stood at the head of the table, not behind it. She didn't like distance, not when things were this important. There were 10 people in the room, her communications lead, her policy director, her youth outreach coordinator, her veteran strategist Reese, and 6 others whose eyes were equal parts exhausted and electrified. On the whiteboard behind her, someone had written in thick marker, "Now what?" Jasmine turned to face them all. Her tone was measured, but her gaze was iron. "Okay," she said, "let's talk about what we're not doing." A pause. "We're not chasing interviews. We're not feeding the machine. I've turned down CNN, MSNBC, Fox, podcasts, even NPR, because I'm not going to let a moment become a commodity." She walked to the board, uncapped a marker, and underlined the words, "Now what?" "Here's what we are doing. We're building something they can't clip." The table was quiet, not from confusion, but anticipation. "I don't want to be the viral congresswoman," Jasmine continued. "I want to be the woman who gave people a method, not just a message. I want to take that 6-second clip and turn it into 6 months of education, real civic literacy, real public courage." Reese leaned forward. "So what's the move? A video campaign?" "No," she said firmly. "A tour." Chairs shifted, eyebrows raised. She clarified, "Not political, educational. A civic engagement tour. Not about me, not about elections, not about flame wars. About how to stand your ground without setting everything on fire. About how to answer, not with rage, but with precision, with truth." She walked to the projector and tapped the spacebar. A map of the U.S. lit up the wall, states glowing in shades of orange and red. Locations where the quote, "I'm not being small" had spiked in searches and shares. It was everywhere. Not just D.C. or New York, but Amarillo, Flint, Boise, Mobile, Gary, Indiana. "They're listening," Jasmine said, "but they don't all have the tools. They don't all know how to respond when they're cut off, shouted down, gaslit, dismissed. They've got the fire. We need to give them the framework." Her policy director crossed his arms, skeptical but curious. "You want to train people to, what? Debate better?" Jasmine turned, eyes sharp. "Not debate, defend. Defend their dignity without losing their temper. Defend their values without feeding the outrage economy. Defend their right to speak, not with slogans but with substance." She clicked again. Now a slide with 4 bold words. Listen, clarify, confront, hold. "That's our model," she said. "Listen with full attention. Clarify the distortion, confront the lie, hold the line. That's how we win. Not by screaming louder, but by standing firmer." She looked around the room. No stages, no big donors, no fancy backdrops, just folding chairs, dry erase boards, and conversations that don't go viral, but go deep. Her youth organizer raised a hand. "You want to start with college towns?" Jasmine shook her head. "We start where no one else goes. Rural districts, underfunded schools, union halls, veteran centers, churches where politics are taboo. I want to talk to the girl who's the only one in her civics class asking hard questions. The factory worker who's been told to stay in his lane. The teacher who's afraid to speak up at the next school board meeting because someone will call her emotional. I want to teach them how not to shrink." One staffer murmured, "That's bigger than a tour." "That's a doctrine." Jasmine smiled, not wide, but deep. "It's a defense strategy for democracy." The energy in the room shifted. Phones were pulled out, notes taken, calendars opened. But Jasmine raised a hand. "Before we get into logistics, you need to hear one thing clearly." They looked up. "I'm not doing this to prove a point," she said. "I'm doing this because I'm tired of watching people survive rooms they should own. I'm tired of watching women and young people and people of color explain themselves over and over just to be heard. I'm tired of the false choice between being respected and being real. She took a breath. This isn't PR. This is repair. The silence that followed wasn't hesitant. It was reverent. Reese finally broke it. So what do we call it? Jasmine walked back to the whiteboard. Under Now What, she wrote, the Civic Clarity Tour. Then beneath it, slowly and in all caps, we're not being small. And in that moment, there was no applause. No cameras, just purpose. And it was louder than any mic. The Civic Clarity Tour didn't begin with a fanfare. No press, no countdown, no cameras following her into the building, just wind cutting across a flat Oklahoma sky and the dull rattle of a rusted gym door as Jasmine Crockett stepped inside. Catoosa wasn't on anyone's radar. It was a quiet town with more grain silos than traffic lights, a place where people didn't go viral, they went to church. And that was exactly why Jasmine chose it. The gymnasium smelled like old linoleum and gym socks. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. No flags, no banners. Just 47 metal folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, half of them occupied. A chalkboard wheeled in from the middle school next door had the words "Clarity is Power" scribbled in clean white script. A few elderly locals sat with arms folded. A teenager in a hoodie stared into her phone. Two ranchers whispered near the back. They weren't here for a show. They were here out of suspicion, or maybe curiosity. Jasmine wore no mic, no podium, just a simple dark blue blazer and a thin notebook in her hand. She stood at the center, not above them, not behind anything, just there, present, bare, whole. She looked around and began, not with a lecture, but with a question. What does it feel like, she asked, voice even, to be silent so long that you forget what your voice sounds like? No one answered, but something shifted. A woman in the third row uncrossed her arms. A teenage boy at the edge of the row leaned forward. Jasmine continued, we're told silence is strength, that calm is control. But what if silence is just survival? What if being quiet is how we disappear piece by piece? Still no applause, just breathe. I came here, she said, not to talk at you, but to show you how to talk back, to a system that expects you to stay quiet, stay civil, stay small. A man in the back raised his hand. He was wearing a red flannel shirt and a John Deere hat. You really think talking different is going to change anything in Washington? Jasmine nodded slowly. I don't expect Congress to change overnight, but I know for a fact that a single sentence, said the right way, can stop someone from being steamrolled in a school board meeting, or fired unfairly, or dismissed because their voice shakes when they speak. He crossed his arms but didn't argue. She turned to the chalkboard, wrote 4 words in all caps. Listen, clarify, confront, hold. This is the framework, not for winning arguments, but for refusing to disappear. She pointed at each word as she spoke. Listen to what's being said beneath the insult. Clarify the distortion before it hardens into someone else's truth. Confront with calm, with facts, not fire. Hold your ground, your truth, your presence, especially when they expect you to shrink. There was no fanfare, no background music, just her voice, steady and soft. Someone coughed. The girl in the hoodie finally looked up. Then Jasmine pulled out a piece of paper. Let me show you something real. She held it up. It was a transcript of a congressional hearing, her own. 5 minutes, 17 interruptions, 1 accusation of being combative, not a single apology. She let the silence sit. And when I finally called it out, what did they say? That I was angry, emotional, disrespectful. A woman in the front murmured, that happens to me at work. Jasmine met her eyes. Exactly. And every time it happens, they chip away a little more of your voice, until one day you stop raising your hand. She stepped back, let the room breathe. Then she said, but what if you didn't? A man raised his hand. Easier said than done. Jasmine smiled. That's why I'm not just saying it. I'm going to show you how. She pulled out a chair, sat down, and invited him to role play. He hesitated but came forward. "What's something you've been afraid to say in a meeting?" she asked. He rubbed his chin. "That we're understaffed, that safety's becoming a problem." "Okay," she said. "I'll be your boss. Push back on me." He nodded and began. "I think our team's stretched too thin. We need more hands before someone gets hurt." Jasmine responded, playing the part. "We've been fine so far. Sounds like you're exaggerating." He froze. "See? That's what happens. I back off." "Let's rewind," she said. "This time clarify before you confront." He tried again. "I'm not saying people aren't working hard, but the workload's doubled. I'm concerned about burnout and safety." Jasmine nodded. "Good, now hold. Don't apologize for the concern. Hold it, even if I sigh, even if I smirk." He exhaled, and the room clapped. Not loudly, not all at once, but it clapped, because they saw it, the shift. It wasn't about yelling. It was about staying upright when everything around you tells you to duck. Jasmine stood again. "We're not here to clap back," she said. "We're here to stay standing." A young woman stood next. "What do you say when someone says, 'You're overreacting'?" "Say this," Jasmine replied. "Maybe you're used to ignoring this issue, but that doesn't mean it's not real." The woman nodded, writing it down furiously. Then the boy in the hoodie raised his hand. "What if they just laugh?" Jasmine looked him in the eye. "Then you just became unforgettable because you didn't flinch." She stepped back again and addressed the whole room. "Don't worry about being liked. Worry about being heard. And once you're heard, be ready for the echo. Because once one person stands up with clarity, it gives permission to 10 more." She gathered her notes. There was no standing ovation, but people stood, one by one. They didn't cheer. They approached. A woman in a cafeteria apron handed Jasmine a sticky note before leaving. It said, "I didn't know I could say things like that. Now I want to teach my daughter to." A rancher pressed her palm and whispered, "I came in here with my fists up, but you didn't swing. You just stood. That takes more guts." Jasmine thanked them, shook hands, packed her things. When she walked out of the gym, the air was cooler, heavier with meaning. Not everyone had been won over, but they'd been moved. And in this fight, that was enough to shift the ground. When she got into the car, Reese was already checking the route for the next town. "You think it worked?" he asked, not looking up. Jasmine buckled her seatbelt, glanced once in the rearview mirror, not at herself, but at the empty gym door behind her. "It's not about if it worked," she said. "It's about who walked out of there standing taller than they came in." Reese nodded, then started the engine. The Civic Clarity Tour had begun, not with applause, but with recognition. They didn't throw tomatoes. They threw silence, smirks, and side glances. By the third stop of the Civic Clarity Tour, Jasmine Crockett felt it. The air was thicker, not with heat, but hostility. Not the kind that burns, the kind that coils. This time, the venue was in central Pennsylvania, a modest community center, just off a highway exit forgotten by GPS. The building was surrounded by flat gravel, rusted flagpoles, and a small group of protesters holding pre-printed signs. "She wants to cancel you." "Speech not equal feelings." "Crockett equals division." They didn't chant. They didn't scream. They just stood there, quiet, still, and armed with a weapon far more efficient than outrage: contempt. Inside, chairs were half filled, about 30 people, maybe less. Jasmine's team had arranged for 60. One row had only one woman sitting at the end, arms folded across her denim jacket like a locked gate. Reese whispered as they entered. "Local Facebook group tried to tank the event. Said you're bringing the woke virus into town." Jasmine didn't flinch. She set her folder on the table at the front and looked out into the dim, unamused room. This wasn't a crowd waiting to be inspired. This was a room waiting to confirm its doubts about her. That was fine. She had clarity, and clarity doesn't need applause. She stood. "Before we start," Jasmine said, "I want to name the room I just walked into." A pause. "I see some of you looking at me like I've already said something wrong. But here's the thing. I haven't spoken yet, and that's part of the story." People shifted in their seats. Some looked away. Others leaned in, uncertain. "I've been called a lot of things the last 2 weeks. Hero, problem, voice, threat. But the truth is, I'm just someone who thinks people deserve tools to speak up without being shouted down. A man in the third row, older, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight, raised his hand, not politely, but like a challenge. You say you're about free speech, but all I see is more division. You show up, and now half the county's fighting on Facebook. Jasmine didn't blink. That's not because I showed up. That's because no one ever taught us how to have a disagreement without making it personal. He scoffed. So now you're teaching manners? She stepped forward. No, she said. I'm teaching boundaries. Because the line between debate and dismissal is thinner than you think, and most people only notice it when they've been shoved across it. From outside, a knock echoed against the window. One of the protesters had pressed their sign against the glass. Stop playing victim. Jasmine turned, eyes locked. Funny thing about that word, victim, she said. People throw it like an insult. But let's be clear, pointing out a pattern isn't weakness, it's awareness. Naming that you've been silenced doesn't make you fragile. It makes you a witness. And some folks aren't scared of victimhood. They're scared of people who stop accepting it. A ripple moved across the room. Not quite agreement, but discomfort breaking. Another hand rose. A younger man this time, dressed in flannel and worn boots. You talk a lot about race, gender, power, but why always identity? Why not just talk like we're all the same? Jasmine nodded slowly. Because we're not all treated the same, and pretending we are doesn't unify us. It erases people. I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here to remind you that justice doesn't work unless it fits everyone. Someone clapped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long, but it was the first sound not loaded with suspicion. Midway through, Jasmine paused to hand out a worksheet. Basic scenarios. Phrases like, that's not what I meant. You're being too sensitive. Let's not make this about race. You always make it personal. She asked them to underline which one they'd heard in the last month. Almost every hand moved. Then she asked a harder question. How many of you shut down instead of answering? No one spoke, but 30 silent nods said everything. She pointed to the chalkboard. Listen, clarify, confront, hold. That's why I'm here. Because if we're going to fix anything, we need to fix the part where silence feels safer than truth. Someone from the back shouted, You think you're brave? Jasmine turned without hesitation. No, I think I'm prepared. And I think bravery looks a lot like preparation when the room is built to undo you. As the session neared its end, tension turned into something else. Curiosity. The man who scoffed earlier stayed behind afterward, said nothing for a long time, then mumbled, My wife watches you. I thought you were just angry. But today wasn't what I expected. Jasmine smiled. Clarity rarely is. As they packed, Reese looked at her. You want to talk to the press? Local radio's outside. They want to know what you think about the pushback. She shook her head. Let them ask the protesters what they heard. The question isn't whether I was clear, it's whether they were ready for clarity. That night, she scrolled through local news reports. The headlines were predictable. Tense exchange at civic tour stop. Congresswoman Crockett accused of sewing division. Both sides claimed civility in heated visit. She turned off the phone. It didn't matter, because in the parking lot, a teenage girl had slipped her a note. Crumpled paper. 3 words. I stayed upright. And in Jasmine's book? That was the headline. The next morning began like any other on the road. Weak hotel coffee, headlines Jasmine didn't ask for, and a campaign inbox flooded with noise. But tucked between a fundraising request and a local op-ed calling her an emotional liability with a microphone, there it was. Subject, from East Lubbock, just a note. The sender's name was Marlene B. The email was short. No hashtags, no agenda. Just breathe. Congresswoman Crockett, I'm 72 years old. I've lived through segregation, integration, assassination, resignation. I raised 3 kids, lost 1, buried a husband, and outlived half the friends who marched with me in 1968. And somehow, I've never said what I actually thought in a room full of men. Last week, my granddaughter played your interview for me. The one where you said, I'm not being small. She looked me in the eye and said, You've been quiet so long, Grandma. You forgot you could be clear too. I cried, thank you. If your tour ever comes through East Lubbock, I'll be sitting in the front row. No questions, just gratitude. Marlene B. Jasmine read it twice, then printed it out and slid it gently across the table to Reese. He scanned it slowly, then looked up. We don't have East Lubbock on the schedule. I know, Jasmine said softly. He leaned back in his chair, eyebrows rising. You want to add it? I want to build around it, she replied. The original tour route had been carefully crafted. Blue-leaning cities in red states, college towns, union hubs, safe zones where resistance wouldn't smother the message. But Marlene wasn't in a safe zone. Marlene was in a forgotten zip code where the only thing louder than silence was shame, where Sunday sermons came with side-eye warnings about uppityness, and neighbors still use phrases like, that kind of talk don't get you hired. So Jasmine made a decision. They would reroute everything, not just for Marlene, for every quiet soul who never got to clap back, who never learned how to say, I matter without stuttering. 3 weeks later, the Civic Clarity Tour arrived in East Lubbock. There was no parade, no mural welcome, just folding chairs in a dusty church basement that smelled like pine sol and pipe rust. When Jasmine walked in, she spotted her immediately. Second row, white blouse, purple pin on her lapel. Marlene. She didn't smile like a fangirl. She nodded like a soldier who saw someone else finally show up to the fight. Jasmine gave no grand entrance. She just stepped up and said, Tonight isn't about me talking. It's about us unlearning. A few people in the back scoffed. One woman whispered, Unlearn what? Jasmine smiled. The lie that silence keeps the peace. The session began with hesitation, a few polite nods, folded arms, careful eyes. Jasmine could feel the generational weight in the room. Older black men conditioned to survive by shrinking, women taught to be pleasant, younger folks torn between fire and fear. She handed out a sheet titled, The Cost of Quiet. Each line had a prompt. The last time I wanted to speak but didn't was, I stayed silent because if I had spoken, I think. She waited. 5 minutes passed. Then finally Marlene raised her hand. I was 23. It was a bank meeting. I had the best numbers in the department. But when they promoted Rick, the man I trained, I smiled and clapped like it was normal. Her voice didn't shake. Her silence had. Jasmine stepped closer. What would you say to that room now? Marlene looked straight ahead. I'd say, you didn't pass me over. You just proved I was never invisible. You were. The room shifted. No one clapped. No one had to. The weight had landed. Others followed. A teenage boy admitted he let a teacher misgender him for 2 semesters because he didn't want to make it a thing. A retired veteran whispered that his wife still lowers her voice when she disagrees with him, even after 40 years of marriage. A pastor's daughter shared that she'd practiced saying, I disagree in the mirror, but had never said it aloud. Jasmine let them speak, then said, Clarity doesn't mean confrontation. It means you stop asking permission to exist. Afterward, Marlene walked up slowly. I wasn't planning to say anything, she confessed, but I realized, if not now, when? Jasmine nodded, eyes soft. That's the question, isn't it? Marlene smiled. You changed the route for me. Jasmine held her hand and whispered, No, you revealed the route. I just had to stop pretending I already knew the way. That night, Jasmine sat in the back seat of the car as they drove west, past cotton fields and gas stations that hadn't changed since 1983. She stared out the window, not to rest, to remember. Marlene hadn't been a headline. She had been a compass, and Jasmine wasn't building a tour anymore. She was building a blueprint, not for sound bites, for freedom, the kind you don't shout, the kind you own. The road out of East Lubbock stretched long and flat, framed by nothing but telephone poles and dusk. Jasmine watched the land roll past, silent, wide, unchanged. But inside her, something had shifted. Marlene's voice wasn't just a memory, it was a mirror. And as the headlights cut through the coming dark, Jasmine understood. The true confrontation had never been with Bill Maher, or a hostile crowd, or even a system rigged to mute her. The real battle was over who got to define clarity, and who was told to apologize for wielding it. What this story teaches, brutally, beautifully, is that silence is not always peace, and civility, when weaponized, becomes the polished blade of power. Jasmine Crockett walked into rooms designed to unmake her, where laughter masked dismissal, where politeness was demanded only from the oppressed, and where truth was welcomed only if it didn't sting. She wasn't loud, she wasn't cruel, but she was clear. And that, in a world bent on fog, is revolutionary. In every paused breath, between Maher's jabs, every green room chill, every headline that called her divisive for simply refusing to shrink, she exposed a deeper sickness, the comfort of those who've never had to fight for their voice, mocking those who do. Because when a black woman names injustice calmly, the world calls her emotional. When she raises her voice, the world calls her angry. When she wins the argument without raising her voice at all, they call it a moment. But Jasmine didn't want a moment. She wanted a shift. And moments pass. Shifts change ground. That is the lesson that echoed louder than applause. Clarity doesn't require rage. Dignity doesn't require permission. And truth, when spoken without fear, is its own kind of weapon. But the cruel irony is this. The clearer Jasmine became, the more the world tried to distort her. Her words were lifted, twisted, clipped into memes and sound bites. Clapback queen. Too smart to cancel. Weaponized calm. They called her everything except what she was. A woman refusing to perform silence just to be allowed in the room. That's the human cost of speaking plainly. You don't just risk being unheard, you risk being misheard. Deliberately, publicly, endlessly. And still, she didn't retreat. She rerouted the tour. She chose the forgotten zip codes. She entered the rooms where no one clapped at the start, and many didn't even make eye contact. Because Jasmine understood something most politicians have forgotten. You don't need to be loved to be right. You don't need to be viral to be effective. What you need is courage that doesn't bend when cornered, and a truth so steady it can walk through fire without flinching. The lesson is not that people applauded her clarity. The lesson is that they needed it to remember their own. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.